In 1942, the United States was bleeding in silence. Across the North Atlantic, German U-boats were sinking ships faster than America could replace them. On paper, the war of attrition was already lost. And yet, just 24 months later, the ocean was crowded with American steel. A ghost fleet so vast, it didn't just cross the Atlantic, it erased the math of the Axis war effort entirely. How did a nation ranked 19th in military power, behind countries like Portugal, outproduce the entire Axis combined in less than 1,000 days? The answer isn't found on the battlefield. It's found inside empty car factories, assembly lines that never slept, and a production system so radical it changed how wars are won forever. This is the untold story of how American factories outbuilt the impossible. There's a certain chill you feel when you walk into a machine shop that hasn't seen a spark in a year. It's not just the temperature, it's the heaviness of tools that have forgotten the touch of a hand. That was the reality of the late 30s. We were a nation of builders with nothing to build. Those idle chimneys you see in the old photos, they weren't just brick and mortar. They were giant, cold fingers pointing at a sky that no longer held the smoke of progress. But why does that matter when we talk about winning a world war? Because history often forgets that in 1939, the United States Army was ranked 19th in the world. To put that in perspective, we were sitting just behind Portugal. We weren't a superpower, we were a sleeping giant with a rusted engine. The common belief, the one they often teach in the condensed history books, is that Pearl Harbor happened, a switch was flipped, and suddenly tanks started rolling off the lines like hotcakes. But the reality is far more complex and, frankly, far more impressive. It wasn't a switch, it was a painful, grinding gear shift that required us to reinvent the very idea of work. Think back to the cost-plus contracts. Many of us remember the skepticism surrounding government spending, but this was different. Before 1941, if a company built a tank that didn't work, they went bankrupt. The purple value here is the sheer audacity of the risk sharing. The government told Detroit, "You build it, we'll cover the cost, plus a small profit." That single policy turned those idle chimneys back into fire-breathing dragons. It removed the fear of failure, and in doing so, it unlocked the greatest surge of human productivity the world has ever seen. By early 1942, the Industrial Awakening was no longer a dream, it was a physical force. We weren't just making parts, we were making parts that made parts. We were standardizing the turn of a screw and the width of a steel plate so that a boy from Nebraska could fix a truck in the middle of North Africa with a part made in Pittsburgh. Therefore, when we look at those cold chimneys of 1939, we shouldn't see them as a sign of weakness. We should see them as the coiled spring of the American spirit. The silence of the Depression was merely the intake of breath before the loudest, most sustained roar of production in human history. We didn't just outbuild Hitler, we out-imagined the very limits of what a factory could be. This chapter is where the myth of the German juggernaut meets the cold, hard reality of the assembly line. We've all seen the old newsreels, the crisp uniforms, the terrifying precision of the Tiger tanks, and the propaganda that suggested the Third Reich was a seamless, high-tech machine. It's an image that has lingered for 80 years. But the staggering reality that history often glosses over is this: German efficiency was a mile wide and an inch deep. While they were building individual masterpieces of engineering, we were building a system of victory. If you ask the average person about German engineering, they'll talk about precision, and they aren't wrong. A Tiger tank was a marvel of mechanical genius. But in a world at war, precision can be a trap. Think of it like this. The Germans were building Ferraris while the world was demanding Fords. Every Tiger tank was practically hand-built. If a transmission broke on a muddy road in Russia, you couldn't just grab a spare from the truck behind you. That part was likely machined specifically for that individual tank. Therefore, the very thing that made their equipment superior on paper made it a nightmare in the field. By 1943, the German army was a logistical patchwork. We often imagine them fully motorized, but the reality is much more primitive. Did you know that for the duration of the war, the modern Wehrmacht relied on over 2.7 million horses? Many of us remember the strength of the American mule, but imagine trying to run a global conquest on horsepower, the literal kind. While American GIs were moving at the speed of the internal combustion engine, the efficient Germans were often moving at the speed of a hay-fed animal. It was a 19th century logistics system trying to support a 20th century war. The conflict here wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the boardroom. Hitler had a fascination with Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. He wanted the biggest, the heaviest, and the most complex. But as any of us who have spent time under the hood of a car know, complexity is just another word for more things that can go wrong. The Germans suffered from what we might call feature creep. They were constantly tweaking designs mid-production. They produced dozens of different versions of the same tank, each requiring different tools, different training, and different spare parts. In the time it took Germany to produce one Tiger tank, the American factories in places like Grand Blanc, Michigan, were turning out 15 M4 Shermans. Our tanks weren't better in a one-on-one duel, but they were available. Our fathers understood a fundamental truth that the high command in Berlin ignored. A perfect tank that is stuck in a repair shop is worth less than a good tank that is on the front line. While the German factories were being run like artist studios focused on slow, individual perfection, American factories were operating like cathedrals of synchronization. You see, we chose a different path. We embraced the power of the average. We realized that we didn't need the world's fastest or most complex tank. What we actually needed was a machine that a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa could fix with nothing more than a crescent wrench in the middle of a muddy rainstorm. We prioritized reliability over sophistication, and that made all the difference. This led to a radical difference in the kill ratio legend. History buffs love to point out how many Shermans it took to knock out a Tiger, but they forget to ask who could afford the loss. Because we had standardized our logistics, an American unit could lose 70% of its vehicles and be back at full strength in days. If a German unit lost 70%, they were effectively erased from the map. The chaos of the Wehrmacht was the result of an ego that prioritized the weapon over the supply chain. But the American Ghost Fleet wasn't just about ships. It was a ghost of a system that haunted the Germans. Every time they destroyed an American truck, 3 more appeared on the horizon. Every time they sank a ship, 2 more slid down the ramps in California. We out-organized them before we ever outfought them. The illusion of efficiency was shattered not by a better gun, but by the relentless, boring, and magnificent power of the American spare part. This transition brings us to a story that, for many of us, feels like a piece of personal history. We all remember the Cadillac as the gold standard, the heavy chrome, the velvet ride, the ultimate symbol that you'd finally made it. But in 1942, that icon of American success underwent a transformation that was frankly a bit of a shock to the system. The remarkable reality is that the softest ride in America was about to become the backbone of the most brutal reconnaissance missions in Europe. It's a transformation that redefined what American luxury could do when the stakes were life and death. Imagine walking into a Cadillac dealership in 1940. You're looking at the Series 62, a car built for comfort and prestige. Now imagine that same floor just 18 months later. The smell of expensive leather has been replaced by the scent of ozone, hot oil, and welding sparks. The common belief is that converting a car factory to a tank plant was just a matter of changing the molds. In reality, it was a mechanical nightmare. A Cadillac engine was designed to be whisper quiet, the pinnacle of refinement. But a tank engine needed to scream for 18 hours straight without ceasing. Cadillac engineers didn't just change their product, they had to change their industrial DNA.
When the M5 Stuart light tank finally began rolling off those Cadillac lines, it carried a strange paradox. It was built with the precision and care of a luxury car, yet it was destined for the sheer brutality of the front lines. The M5 wasn't a heavy hitter, it was a scout. It was the eyes of the army, which meant it was often the first to draw fire and the last to receive support. It was a machine built for elegance, but forced into a life of grit. Here is where the American knack for improvisation really shines. Instead of designing a massive, unproven tank engine from scratch, which would have taken years, Cadillac engineers did something brilliant. They used what they already had. They took two Cadillac V8 engines and mated them together. This twin Cadillac power plant gave the M5 a reliability that the Germans couldn't dream of. Many of us know the frustration of a car that won't start on a cold morning. Now imagine that frustration when a Panzer is 500 yards away. Because the M5 used refined automotive technology, it was arguably the most reliable piece of armor in the war. It could hit 36 miles per hour, a terrifying speed for a tank in the 1940s, weaving through hedgerows while the heavier German tanks were still trying to warm up their temperamental engines.
However, there was a bitter irony in this engineering miracle. While the engine had the soul of a Cadillac, the soldiers inside found none of the luxury that the name implied. The M5 was cramped, deafeningly loud, and dangerously thin-skinned. Within that steel box, the velvet ride of the Series 62 was replaced by a brutal reality. They were protected by barely an inch of steel, trusting their lives to American horsepower in a race against German 88s. We often hear about the glory of tank battles, but the men in the M5s lived a different reality. Their job was to go looking for trouble. They were the canaries in the coal mine. When we look closer at the men who manned these machines, the sobering truth is the sheer vulnerability they accepted every single day. You see, the M5's armor was only about an inch thick in most places. To a German 88mm gun, that steel plating might as well have been made of paper. The men who operated these tanks, often just boys barely out of high school, knew that their best defense wasn't the metal surrounding them. It was the Cadillac engine's ability to get them out of a situation just as fast as they'd entered it. They traded safety for speed, trusting their lives to American horsepower. Therefore, the relationship between the worker in Detroit and the scout in France was a sacred bond. The worker knew that if a weld was weak or a gear was slightly out of alignment, that Cadillac-powered scout wouldn't come home. By the end of the war, Cadillac had produced nearly 15,000 light tanks and gun motor carriages. It's a staggering number when you realize that each one represented a luxury car that wasn't built. The company that defined the American dream of comfort spent 4 years defining the American reality of sacrifice. When we look at a vintage Cadillac today, we shouldn't just see the fins and the chrome. We should see the ghost of the M5, the brutal, fast, and reliable machine that proved American industry could turn its hand from the finest comforts to the hardest necessities without skipping a beat. It wasn't just about outproducing the enemy, it was about out-engineering them with the tools we already had in our garages. This story now takes us out to the gray, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. It's a narrative defined by numbers, but more importantly, it's a race against time. We often think of the war being won by a single decisive battle, like Midway or D-Day. But for the men of the merchant marine and the shipbuilders back home, the war was won in a ledger book. In 1942, the war had become a matter of simple, brutal arithmetic. The Germans were sinking ships faster than the world could possibly build them. And during that grim year, Allied shipping losses peaked at over 7.8 million tons. We were quite literally bleeding to death at sea. If the American factories didn't find a way to outpace the German torpedoes, the entire war effort would have been strangled in its crib before it ever truly began. Imagine standing on the coast of North Carolina in mid-1942. If you looked out past the surf, you might have seen the smoke rising from the horizon. This was Operation Drumbeat, a time when German U-boats operated with such impunity that they called it the second happy time. They were sinking American tankers within sight of our own beaches, and for the German High Command, this wasn't just naval warfare, it was a cold calculation of attrition. The equation was simple but brutal. A U-boat cost a mere fraction of a cargo ship, yet it could sink 10 of them before ever being caught. The Germans believed that if they could sink 700,000 tons of shipping every month, Britain would starve. The challenge for America was no longer just about finding the submarine. The mission had shifted to outproducing the torpedo itself. To survive, we didn't just need a ship, we needed a miracle of mass production. We needed the Liberty ship. When the first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, was finally launched, President Roosevelt didn't offer praise. He called it a dreadful-looking object. Time magazine was equally blunt, dubbing it the ugly duckling. It was slow, it was boxy, and it was built using a technique that many old-school shipwrights considered a dangerous gamble: welding instead of riveting. To those accustomed to the elegant liners of the past, these ships looked like industrial accidents. But beauty wasn't the objective. We didn't have the luxury of time to drive millions of rivets by hand. We needed a way to manufacture hulls as if they were coming off an automotive assembly line. This ugly duckling was designed for one purpose: to be built faster than the enemy could sink them. Many of us who have worked in trades know the debate between a rivet and a weld. A rivet is honest, but it's slow. It takes a crew of 4. A weld is fast, but if it's done wrong, the ship can literally snap in half in cold water. But we didn't have the luxury of time. Because we moved to welding and modular construction, we didn't just build ships, we manufactured them. The staggering reality of the Liberty program was the sheer impossible speed of this industrial miracle. At the start of the war, it took roughly 230 days to launch a single cargo ship. But by 1943, that timeline had been shattered, with American shipyards averaging just 40 days per vessel. We weren't just putting steel in the water, we were outbuilding the enemy's ability to destroy. To prove exactly what American labor was capable of, workers at the Richmond shipyard in California eventually launched a complete ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It was a pace that redefined the limits of human productivity forever. And then came the SS Robert E. Peary. To prove what American labor could do, workers in Richmond, California laid the keel and launched the entire ship in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. By 1944, the momentum of the war had shifted in a way that was truly magnificent. The Germans were still sinking ships at a record pace, but they were now playing a game they fundamentally couldn't win. The sheer scale of American industrial power had reached its peak, and we were now launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. Think about that for a moment. Every 8 hours, a new 10,000-ton bridge of steel was sliding into the water. The U-boats would sink a ship, but by the time they surfaced to reload their torpedoes, 2 more had already been born in a shipyard in Oregon or Maryland. We weren't just winning the battle, we were making the battle irrelevant. We were overwhelming the math of attrition with the math of the assembly line. Think about that for a second. Every 8 hours, a new 10,000-ton bridge of steel was sliding into the water. The U-boats would sink a ship, but by the time they surfaced to reload their torpedoes, 2 more had already been born in a shipyard in Oregon or Maryland. We weren't just winning the battle, we were making the battle irrelevant. We were overwhelming the math of attrition with the math of the assembly line. Yet we must remember that this industrial miracle came with a heavy human cost. These ugly ducklings were often manned by civilian sailors who faced the freezing Atlantic with no armor and little hope of rescue if they were hit. It was their quiet bravery that allowed the bridge of ships to hold, ensuring that the tanks from Cadillac and the planes from Ford actually reached the front lines. Today, most of those 2,700 Liberty ships are gone, quietly recycled into the cars we drove in the 50s or the skyscrapers that rose in the 60s. It's a remarkable testament to their construction that machines built to last only 5 years often ended up serving for 30. Looking past these steel giants, however, we have to pull back the curtain on the factory floor itself. We often talk about the miracle of production as if it were a magic trick, but every miracle has a price tag. For the generation on the home front, that price wasn't just measured in tax dollars, it was measured in the very identity of the American worker. Before the war, being a machinist or a shipwright was more than just a job, it was a life's work. You started as an apprentice, spent years learning the unique feel of the metal, and took immense pride in building a machine from the ground up. In those days, you weren't just an employee, you were a craftsman. That all changed with the urgent demands of 1942. There was simply no room left for that slow, methodical pace. To build 50,000 planes a year, the nation couldn't wait for men to spend 5 years learning a trade. We needed a new kind of worker, someone who could learn a single vital task in just 5 days. This necessity forced a radical transformation across American industry, a process often called de-skilling. We began breaking complex engineering feats down into tiny, repetitive motions. Instead of one master craftsman building an entire engine, we now had 100 people, each dedicated to turning a single bolt or stamping a single sheet of metal. It was a sacrifice of individual artistry for the sake of collective survival. Many of us still remember our fathers and grandfathers took pride in their personal tools, the worn handles and the precise calibrations that were an extension of their own hands. But as the war reached its height, that relationship fundamentally shifted. The factory itself became the primary tool, and the worker was now a vital part of a much larger, relentless mechanism.
In this new era, the individual was no longer the master of the machine. They were a gear within it. This change allowed for a speed of production that was previously unimaginable, but it also demanded a new kind of discipline. Every movement had to be synchronized, every second accounted for, as the entire nation transformed into a singular, breathing engine of war. This was the high cost of speed. We gained the ability to outproduce the world, but we lost the individual's connection to the finished product. A woman working at the Willow Run plant might spend 8 hours a day installing the same 3 rivets in the wing of a B-24 Liberator. She was essential to the war effort, but she was being systematically erased from the creative process of building. This sacrifice of craftsmanship for speed allowed us to integrate millions of unskilled workers, farmers, housewives, and retirees into the industrial machine. It was the only way to hit the numbers. But for the old guard craftsman, it felt like the world was moving toward a future where the machine was the master and the human was the servant. We often celebrate the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, and rightly so. Her contribution was a pillar of our victory. But we rarely talk about the master machinist who stood beside her, the man who saw his decades of hard-earned knowledge suddenly replaced by a simple steel jig or a wooden template. These tools allowed a teenager straight out of high school to perform his complex job with 90% accuracy on their very first day. It was a quiet, often overlooked sacrifice. This shift meant that the deep intuition of the veteran worker, the know-how that usually took a lifetime to acquire, was being systematically designed out of the process in favor of raw speed. While it was the only way to fill the sky with planes and the sea with ships, it marked a turning point where the wisdom of the individual began to give way to the efficiency of the jig. This shift created a psychological friction. The war required us to become a mass society. We needed mass production, mass media, and mass mobilization. The individual craft worker, the man who could fix anything with a file and a prayer, became a relic of a slower, more deliberate America. It's important to realize that this very erasure of the master craftsman was the catalyst that made the Ghost Fleet possible. Had we insisted on every ship being a masterpiece, the war would likely have been lost by 1943.
Instead, America made a calculated, revolutionary choice. We chose good enough in massive, overwhelming quantities over perfection in tiny, handcrafted batches. We stopped building art and we started building victory. When the veterans finally came home and the factories shifted their focus back to cars and refrigerators, this new way of working didn't simply vanish. The lessons we learned during that desperate push for speed became the permanent blueprint for the American middle class of the 1950s. In many ways, we made a monumental trade. We surrendered the individual soul of the craftsman for the widespread prosperity of the consumer. It was this very shift that allowed a generation to own homes, drive new cars every few years, and build the world we recognize today. The ghost of the wartime assembly line lived on in every suburban kitchen and every chrome-heavy sedan, proving that the sacrifices made on the factory floor in 1942 were the foundation of the American dream in 1955. The American worker didn't just give their sweat to the war, they gave their status as an artisan. They accepted the anonymity of the assembly line so that the men on the front lines would never run out of ammo. It was a quiet, humble sacrifice that fundamentally reshaped the American soul, moving us from a nation of makers to a nation of producers. All of this leads us to the heart of our story. We've looked at the empty chimneys of the Depression, the dual Cadillac engines that powered the front lines, and the welded hulls of the Liberty ships that defied the Atlantic. But as we stand here today, 80 years later, a vital question remains. What does this ghost fleet actually have to say to us now? Is it just a relic of the past, or is it a blueprint for our future? Ultimately, we have to realize that the ghost fleet is far more than just a collection of sunken ships or rusted hulls. It stands as the definitive proof of what can happen when a distracted, divided nation finally finds its center of gravity. It serves as a reminder that American strength isn't just about our technology or our wealth, but about our unique capacity to unite under a singular, unstoppable purpose when the world demands it most. If you were to travel today to Suisun Bay in California or the quiet stretches of the James River in Virginia, you can still see them, the few remaining hulls of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. They sit there now, gray, rusted, and silent against the water. To a casual observer, or someone who doesn't know our history, they might look like nothing more than junk floating.
For those who know the history, these ships are far more than scrap metal. They are a modern blueprint. Today, we often live with a nagging feeling that we've lost that industrial muscle memory. We look at our modern challenges and wonder if we could ever flip that switch again, worrying what this ghost fleet is all that remains of our national resolve. To find the answer, we have to look past the rust. The true legacy of these ships isn't the steel itself, it's the social architecture that built them. What the ghost fleet teaches us is that American resolve isn't a constant state of being, it's a reactive force. Back in 1940, we were just as divided, just as tired, and just as skeptical as we are today. The Great Awakening of 1942 proved that our industry doesn't need a master plan handed down from the top. Instead, it thrives when there is a clear, undeniable objective rising from the bottom. It reminds us that when the objective is clear, the impossible simply becomes a matter of production. When we gave the American worker a clear why, the how took care of itself. We often think our fathers were better men, but the truth is more encouraging. They were ordinary men placed in an extraordinary system. They built the ghost fleet because they realized that their individual survival depended on their collective output. Take a moment to consider a statistic that should give us all a moment of pause. At the peak of the war effort, the United States was producing one aircraft every 5 minutes. By the time you finished listening to these words, the ghost fleet would have added another wing, another engine, or another hull to the tally. This wasn't a miracle of magic, it was a miracle of alignment. Labor, management, and government, three groups that historically spend their time at each other's throats, found a common middle ground in the shipyard. This is the true modern blueprint. It serves as a reminder that our greatest strength isn't our technology or our bank accounts, but our ability to simplify our grievances in the face of a greater threat. As we look back on the Ghost Fleet today, we shouldn't feel nostalgic for the war itself. No one who saw it firsthand would ever wish for its return. Instead, we should feel a sense of profound pride in the system of sanity we created. We proved that when we stop fighting each other and start building together, we can outproduce the impossible. We outbuilt Hitler not because we were more efficient in the German sense, but because we were more resilient in the American sense. We built things that could break and be fixed. We built systems that could lose and still win. We turned our luxury car plants into tank shops and our housewives into welders because we understood that a ghost fleet of production is the only thing that can haunt a dictator's dreams. Many of us remember a time when "Made in America" wasn't just a label, but a promise of durability. The legacy of the Ghost Fleet is the reminder that that promise is still in our DNA. It's a blueprint that is sitting on the shelf, waiting for the next time the chimneys need to roar. The ships may be ghosts, but the resolve that built them? That is very much alive. It's in every garage, every machine shop, and every heart that remembers what we are capable of when we stop arguing about the past and start building the future. If you found value in this deep dive into our industrial heritage, there's a simple way to ensure these stories continue to reach those who need to hear them. By hitting the like button, you aren't just supporting the channel, you're telling the algorithm that history still matters. I'd also value your perspective in the comments. Perhaps you or a family member worked in one of these legendary plants, or maybe you remember the first time you saw a Cadillac V8 under the hood. Sharing those personal connections keeps this history alive for the next generation. And if you want to be here for our next deep dive into the untold chapters of the greatest generation, make sure you're subscribed. We're building a community of veterans, historians, and thinkers here, and it would be an honor to have you as part of the fleet.